Puerto Rico is part of the United States, but it often doesn't really feel like it, mostly because while the rest of the country has prospered, Puerto Rico has stalled out completely. And while it might seem like just a run of bad luck, the reality is that the very country that controls Puerto Rico, the United States, is also the one that is strangling it. And as usual, this story begins with the very geography that has defined Puerto Rico for so long. This video is sponsored by Squarespace. To understand why Puerto Rico is in the position it is today, we first have to understand where it actually is. Because when you look at a map of the United States, Puerto Rico usually isn't there. Or if it is, it's floating in a box off the coast of Florida, completely out of scale and context. But in reality, Puerto Rico is the easternmost anchor of the Greater Antilles, the chain of large islands that includes Cuba, Jamaica, and Hispaniola, the island that includes Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It sits roughly 1,000 miles southeast of Miami, roughly the same distance as New York City is from Miami, and acts as a gatekeeper between the open Atlantic Ocean to the north and the Caribbean Sea to the south. And this specific location is the first clue to its turbulent history. Puerto Rico isn't just a tropical island because geographically it's more of a fortress. To the west lies the Mona Passage, a 90-mile wide strait separating Puerto Rico from the Dominican Republic. This passage is one of the most vital shipping lanes in the world, connecting the Atlantic to the Panama Canal. Historically, whoever controlled Puerto Rico controlled the flow of wealth into and out of the Americas. This made the island a prize not just for its resources, but for its location. It was the literal key to the Caribbean. But while its location made it a target, its terrain made it difficult to master. Contrary to the idea of a tropical paradise, Puerto Rico is incredibly mountainous. The island is bisected from east to west by the Cordillera Central, a massive mountain range that rises sharply from the coast. The highest peak, Cerro de Punta, towers over 4,300 feet above sea level. This geography created a stark divide that still exists today. The north is humid and green, fed by trade winds that dump rain as they hit the mountains. The south is drier, almost semi-arid in places, sitting in the rain shadow of the central spine. This rugged interior historically made infrastructure a nightmare. Moving goods from the coffee plantations in the mountains to the ports on the coast was an arduous task. It forced the population to cluster heavily along the narrow coastal plains, specifically in the north around San Juan. This concentration of people makes the island incredibly vulnerable. When a hurricane strikes, there's not many places you can retreat to. The mountains trap the water, sending flash floods rushing down into the densely populated lowland cities. But Puerto Rico isn't just one island, it's actually an archipelago. While the main island gets all the attention, the Commonwealth includes over 140 smaller islands. To the east lies Vieques and Culebra, beautiful islands with their own dark histories of military use. To the west sits the uninhabited Mona Island, often compared to the Galapagos for its unique biology. However, the most terrifying geographic feature of Puerto Rico isn't on the island, it's just off the north coast. Running parallel to the island is the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean. At its lowest point, the Milwaukee Deep, the ocean floor plunges down over 27,000 feet. To put that in perspective, if you dropped Mount Everest into the trench, the peak would still be over a mile underwater. This trench exists because Puerto Rico sits precariously on the boundary between two tectonic plates, the Caribbean plate and the massive North American plate. These plates are grinding against each other, slowly creating a subduction zone that makes the island highly prone to earthquakes. So, we have an island that is 1. Strategically located at a global choke point, 2. Internally divided by a massive mountain range, and 3. Sitting on the edge of an underwater abyss that creates constant seismic threats. It's a beautiful, dangerous, and highly strategic piece of land. And because of that strategic value, powerful nations have always wanted to own it. But the United States didn't just want to own the land, they wanted to fundamentally change the people living on it. And that brings us to the people who were there first, and the empire that tried to erase them. But while empires throughout history have tried to fit people into a very specific mold, today you have the power to define your own destiny and build something that is uniquely yours. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now with my brand new shop, which I built entirely with Squarespace. Guys, I am finally launching an exclusive online store to sell custom maps of all of the places that you see on my videos. Every map is designed by me and only available for a very limited time. And I use Squarespace because I wanted my website to look and feel professional without needing a degree in coding. I use their incredibly helpful new design intelligence features, which combine their design expertise with AI. It helped me build a custom layout that fits my style, so the store feels like a natural extension of the channel. But the best part is actually the back end. I'm using Squarespace payments to manage everything. It was super fast to set up, and now I can accept Apple Pay, Klarna, and all major credit cards all in one place. So, whether you're selling physical goods like my maps, or sending invoices for services, Squarespace makes the business side of website design incredibly easy, so you can focus on creating. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch your own website or shop, go to squarespace.com/geography-by-Geoff to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Check the link in the description below to check out my brand new Squarespace website, and then go set up your own with their help. Squarespace is the best way to make sure that the world knows your name. But for the island of Puerto Rico, the world has been confused about its name and its original identity for centuries. Before it was a territory of the United States, and long before it was ever the rich port, this island had a name given to it by its original inhabitants: Borikén, or the Land of the Brave. The people who lived here were the Taino, and they weren't just a small tribe, they were a complex, thriving civilization that dominated the Caribbean. By the time Christopher Columbus stumbled onto the island in 1493, during his second voyage, the Taino had established large villages, a sophisticated agricultural system, and a culture that prized art and sport. They played a ceremonial ball game in stone-lined courts called batallas, ruins of which you can still stand in today. But the Taino made a fatal mistake. They welcomed the strangers. The Spanish arrived looking for gold, and they found it in the rivers of Borikén. They renamed the island San Juan Bautista, and the main trading port became Puerto Rico, or the Rich Port. Eventually, through a clerical mix-up that stuck, the names swapped. The island became Puerto Rico, and the capital became San Juan. What followed was a genocide. Through forced labor and gold mines, brutal warfare, and most devastatingly, smallpox and measles, the Taino population collapsed. By 1520, the Spanish census claimed the Taino were extinct. But that was a lie. Recent DNA studies have proven that the Taino didn't disappear. They survived by retreating into the mountainous interior and intermarrying with poor Spanish farmers and enslaved Africans brought to the island to work the sugar plantations. Today, the average Puerto Rican carries significant mitochondrial DNA from those original Taino women. The people were not erased, but they were absorbed. Over the next 400 years, Puerto Rico was a neglected military outpost for the Spanish Empire. While other colonies rebelled and gained independence in the 1800s, Puerto Rico remained one of Spain's two wings of the Caribbean, alongside Cuba. But by the end of the 19th century, a new empire was rising in the north. The United States had conquered its own continent, the Atlantic to the Pacific, and was now looking for power overseas. In 1898, the Spanish-American War broke out after the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in Cuba. This was all the US needed for justification to start a war, and claimed it was fighting to liberate Cuba from Spanish tyranny. But when the US Navy bombarded San Juan in May of 1898, they weren't there to liberate Puerto Rico. They were there to acquire it. The invasion of Puerto Rico officially began on May 12, 1898, when a squadron of 12 US ships commanded by Rear Admiral William T. Sampson of the United States Navy attacked San Juan. This was followed on July 25th, when 1,300 infantry soldiers led by Nelson A. Miles disembarked off the coast of Guanica in the southwest. Many locals, tired of centuries of Spanish neglect, welcomed them. They believed the US would grant them the democracy and statehood they craved. They were wrong. When the Treaty of Paris was signed later that year, ending the war, Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the United States. But here's the critical part that set the stage for everything happening today. Puerto Ricans were not at the negotiating table. The island was transferred like property, a literal spoil of war. This created a legal crisis back in Washington. The US Constitution didn't really have a provision for holding colonies indefinitely. The US was supposed to be a republic, not an empire. So, the Supreme Court invented a solution. In a series of decisions, known as the Insular Cases, the Supreme Court ruled that Puerto Rico belonged to, but is not part of, the United States. They labeled it an unincorporated territory, inhabited by alien races who were unable to understand Anglo-Saxon principles of law. This legal limbo meant that the Constitution did not fully apply to Puerto Rico. Congress could do whatever it wanted with the island, and what they did first was try to Americanize it by force. They changed the name to Puerto Rico, a misspelling that lasted until 1932. They made English the mandatory language in schools, firing teachers who spoke Spanish. They tried to strip the culture from the people. But the cultural resistance was too strong. The US realized they couldn't turn Puerto Ricans into Americans overnight. So instead, they decided to turn the island into a profit center. This brings us to the modern era. The United States had the land, and they had the legal cover to rule it without granting rights. Now they just needed to figure out how to extract the maximum value from it while doing the bare minimum to keep it afloat. And the mechanisms they built to do that are exactly what is choking the life out of the island today. The United States didn't just acquire Puerto Rico, it built a legal and economic cage around it by using a very specific set of federal laws that, when combined, create a perfect storm for economic failure. The first bar of this cage was formed in 1920, and it's called the Jones Act. And I don't blame you if you've never heard of it. The US has a lot of obscure laws that actually impact a lot of our daily lives. Officially known as the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, this law sounds patriotic on paper. It requires that all goods transported by water between two US ports be carried on ships that are US flagged, US built, US owned, and US crewed. The goal was to support the American shipping industry after World War I. Before an island nation that imports 85% of its food and goods, the Jones Act is a chokehold. Here's how it works in practice. If a massive cargo ship from China full of electronics is heading to the US East Coast, it might pass right by Puerto Rico, but it can't simply offload goods in San Juan and then continue to Miami. To get those goods to Puerto Rico, they often have to go all the way to Jacksonville, Florida, be offloaded, and then reloaded onto a specialized, far more expensive American ship to then be sent back to San Juan. This logistical nightmare creates a pollution tax on everything. Puerto Ricans pay significantly more for groceries, cars, and energy than Americans on the mainland, despite having a fraction of the average income. But high prices are just the symptom. The real disease was a tax loophole that the US government hooked the island on and then suddenly ripped away. For decades, the US government knew Puerto Rico needed an independent economy. Their solution was Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code. Passed in 1976, Section 936 allowed US manufacturing companies to operate in Puerto Rico without paying federal corporate taxes on their profits. And it worked. Pharmaceutical giants and tech companies flocked to the island. For a while, Puerto Rico was the manufacturing powerhouse of the Caribbean. And this meant that the middle class grew. The economy started to boom. Things were starting to look up in Puerto Rico for the very first time in a very long time. But in 1996, the US Congress decided to balance the budget. They viewed Section 936 as corporate welfare and voted to repeal it, with a 10-year phase-out ending in 2006. The results were catastrophic. When the tax breaks expired in 2006, the factories didn't just wind down. They fled almost overnight. Thousands of high-paying jobs evaporated. The tax base collapsed. Puerto Rico entered a recession in 2006 that it has literally never recovered from. So you have an island with a high cost of living, thanks to the Jones Act, and a collapsing revenue stream, thanks to the repeal of Section 936. How do you keep the lights on? You borrow money. The Puerto Rican government began issuing bonds to pay its bills, and Wall Street loved them. Because of another quirk in US law, Puerto Rican bonds are triple tax exempt. Local, state, and federal taxes don't apply. Investors gobbled them up, enabling the government to dig a deeper and deeper hole. By 2015, the debt had ballooned to over $70 billion, a sum the island could never hope to repay. In a normal US state, or even a city like Detroit, the government would declare Chapter 9 bankruptcy. This legal process allows a government to tell its creditors, we can't pay you everything, so we're going to restructure the debt and pay what we can. But Puerto Rico isn't a state, and it isn't a sovereign country, so it couldn't declare bankruptcy. But it's more nefarious than that. In 1984, a mysterious amendment was added to a federal bill that specifically excluded Puerto Rico from Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection. This meant Puerto Rico was legally prohibited from going bankrupt. They were trapped with their debt, and there was no way to escape it. But something had to give. So, the US Congress eventually stepped in, but not with a bailout. In 2016, they passed the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, which established a fiscal control board. Known locally as La Junta, this unelected board of 7 members appointed by the US president has the final say over Puerto Rico's budget. And they have not been on Puerto Rico's side. They slashed pensions, closed hundreds of schools, and gutted the University of Puerto Rico, all in the name of paying back Wall Street. Effectively, Puerto Rico lost the little democracy it had. The people vote for a governor, but the governor answers to the board. And then things got worse. When Hurricane Maria slammed into the island in 2017, it exposed how little the United States actually cares about its island territory. The response to Hurricane Maria compared to Hurricane Harvey in Texas or Irma in Florida was statistically shameful. A study found that 9 days after the storms, FEMA had approved $141 million in aid for Texas survivors, but only $6 million for Puerto Rico. It took months to restore power to the island, the longest blackout in US history, while US citizens died in hospitals because generators failed. The message was clear: Puerto Ricans may be citizens, but they're not equal citizens. So, why is Puerto Rico failing? It's failing because it's forced to buy goods at inflated prices. It's failing because it was stripped of its primary economic engine. It's failing because it was legally barred from restructuring its debt. And it's failing because it's governed by an unelected board that prioritizes debt repayment over public services. But there is a light at the end of this dark tunnel. In the wake of Hurricane Maria, communities didn't wait for FEMA. They rebuilt their own bridges, cleared their own roads, and are now leading a green energy revolution by installing their own solar grids, independent of the failing power authority. And culturally, the island is becoming a global superpower, exporting music and art that dominates the world stage, proving that you can colonize a land, but you cannot conquer a spirit. Tourism is hitting record highs. The diaspora is reconnecting to invest back home, and a new generation is politically awake, demanding accountability in the streets of San Juan. Puerto Rico's geography defined its past, and its history defined its struggle. But its future? That's finally being written by Puerto Ricans themselves, and if history is any guide, they're very resilient. This week I'm back in the United States, and I'm exploring one of the most dangerous volcanoes in America, Mount Shasta. Because when this one blows, it's gonna hurt. And you can learn all about that story over on my travel channel. I hope you enjoyed learning all about Puerto Rico. If you did, be sure to check out this video all about the US island in the middle of the Pacific that you can't go to. Thanks for watching. See you next time.